8 years ago, the President of Mexico,
Okay, this is on. So let's get started. We have one technical detail that we'll be resolving, but I'll initiate our proceedings. So welcome everyone to today's teach-in on Ayotzinapa, Crimes of State and the Drug War in Mexico. My name is Estelle Tarica. I'm a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I want to start by thanking Mary Mordecai, Kathy Jones, and Veronica Lopez for their support in helping us organize this event. This teach-in is the fruit of organizing efforts by Berkeley faculty and students. It's part of broader initiatives that are taking place across campuses in the US and the world. Other groups who've organized similar events at their universities. We are here today, and so are faculty and students at over 60 campuses, including UCLA, CUNY, NYU, Princeton, the University of Texas, the University of Arkansas, the University of Rio in Brazil, and also in Ayotzinapa, the Escuela Normal Isidro Burgos. This is just a few of the places where students and faculty have come together around this issue. For those of you who'd like to join us as organizers or to receive more information, we have a sign-up sheet on one of the tables by the doors. And also, for those of you who want to tweet, you could use that hashtag over there, 43Global. Reference it or use that if you want to do live tweeting. Tomorrow, Thursday, November 20th, is a day of action. There are actions planned in Mexico, in the US, and in other countries. Here in Berkeley, we'll be gathering at Berkeley City Hall at 11:30 tomorrow morning. Berkeley City Hall is at the corner of Milvia and Center Streets in downtown Berkeley. And then we'll be marching to Sproul for a rally at noon. So either meet us at Berkeley City Hall at 11:30 or meet us at Sproul at noon. We'll be manifesting our outrage at the disappearance of 43 Mexican students, and at the corruption of the Mexican government and Mexican government officials and their complicity with criminal acts. Our aim is to put as much pressure as possible on the Mexican government to act in regard to this matter. We also want to make sure that attention to this issue does not fade away. Because contrary to what President Enrique Peña Nieto has proclaimed, it is not the outrage of protesters that has destabilized Mexico. It is the government's own corruption and its implementation of policies that have impoverished ever more Mexicans ever more greatly, that have destabilized the country. So tomorrow, 11:30 at Berkeley City Hall and noon at Sproul. Today is a different kind of action, related yet different kind of participation and community building. This is a teach-in. We want to analyze, discuss, teach, learn. We want to engage with each other's knowledge. We want to build on it and share our perspectives about what is happening in Mexico right now. We want to take questions. And our aim is to develop a greater understanding and awareness of what Ayotzinapa means. The particular event that our cry for Ayotzinapa invokes is clear: the disappearance and probable murder of 43 students. The violence directed at them and the criminal activity that led to it on the part of state officials remain our focus. Yet the more we learn about it, the more we come to realize that this event is not isolated. It is part of a long regional history in the state of Guerrero in Mexico, part of a long national history in Mexico, and indeed, part of the history of all of the nations of Latin America. We titled our event Ayotzinapa, Crimes of State and the Drug War in Mexico. What do we mean by a crime of state? How is the disappearance of these 43 students a crime of state? To start with, we can say that state officials in Guerrero and indeed throughout the national territory have been so thoroughly penetrated and co-opted by the interests of drug trafficking that we no longer know where one ends and the other begins. Ayotzinapa is a crime of state because it is the state which is ultimately responsible for the climate of impunity that reigns across Mexico, where fewer than 1% of homicides are ever successfully prosecuted by the state. For this, the Mexican government must be held accountable. But while it is imperative that the Mexican government be held accountable to the rule of law, let us not forget that the Mexican rule of law permits state terror against citizens whenever the state feels threatened by their dissent. Because there's an equally or perhaps even more disturbing way that this act of violence can be considered a crime of state. There exists the strong possibility that it might have been state security forces themselves, members of the Mexican army, not drug traffickers, who kidnapped and disappeared the 43 students. Are we now witnessing the return of the dirty war of the 1960s and 70s, when the Mexican government eliminated its political opposition by means of force? Whatever else, Ayotzinapa demonstrates the power of the state to criminalize political dissent, to kidnap protesters and disappear those who threaten to disrupt the state's self-congratulatory political theater. And it demonstrates the extent to which the rule of the strongest in Mexico, whether it be the state or the drug traffickers or international corporations, has become entirely normalized. Today, we'll be hearing different perspectives on Ayotzinapa that build on what I've said and take us in other directions. First, we'll hear from Manuel Cuellar and Edwin Ackerman, who will speak about student activism at the Teachers College in Ayotzinapa and provide us with a timeline of events. Then we'll hear from Yvonne del Valle about why Ayotzinapa has generated such a massive response and what this means. Following Yvonne, Richard Grijalva will speak on coverage of Ayotzinapa in the US media. Then we'll hear from Victor Big, who will speak about a parallel case in Peru when students at the University of La Cantuta were kidnapped and disappeared by a military death squad in 1992, and how President Alberto Fujimori was held accountable for this crime. And Victor will be speaking in Spanish. Finally, we'll hear from Daniel Hernandez, a journalist who is reporting from Mexico and who will transmit to us via telephone about what he's learned in his coverage of the events, and he'll also be taking questions from the audience. So please think of the kinds of things you would like to ask someone who's on the ground. Each presentation will be brief, around 10 minutes, so that we can have ample time for discussion and Q&A afterwards. And this is a forum where we really want to hear your questions and perspectives and open a debate about what is happening in Mexico today. So I'll turn it over now to Manuel.
Thank you everyone for coming out today to the teaching we have organized. There are a few seats available here at the front. Please don't be afraid to occupy those spaces so that people who are coming in late might be able to stand in the back. So there's a couple here and in the middle a few more. We are all part of this collecting. I'm going to be quick, so I'll be showing first a video that the collective Ayotzinapa Somos Todos, who have organized this global forum, have prepared, just to contextualize a little bit of what happened. I'll show like 3 minutes of it.
8 years ago, the president of Mexico, facing a highly contested election, decided to declare a war on drugs. To do this, he called the military to the streets. The results were that Mexico went from having 9,900 murders per year in 2005 to 23,000 in 2013. On December 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto, from the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, became president of Mexico. The PRI was in power from the 1920s until 2000 and had many accusations of disappearance and violence against students. Enrique Peña Nieto's first action as president was to create alliances with Congress to push for reforms, most of them related to the economy. He invested heavily in cleaning Mexico's image abroad, running various editorials in world newspapers, and pushed security to a less prominent place than his predecessor. Yet, the violence continued. Not because you ignore a problem, it means it goes away. In 2013 alone, 23,000 people were killed. 1 out of 3 homes reported to have been subject to a crime, and even the government accepts that more than 90% of crimes are never resolved. On September 26th, a group of students was protesting on Iguala, the third largest city in Mexico's poorest state, Guerrero. The municipal government and the state government both belong to the opposition leftist party, PRD, Party of the Democratic Revolution. The local police came in, killed 6 students and arrested the other 43. There is no record of the students in any jail. In the weeks that followed, 10 mass graves were discovered around Iguala. The mayor of the town and his wife ran away after a local newspaper showed the mayor's brother-in-law was a drug dealer. He was finally found on the 4th of November, hiding in Mexico City. While this crisis was going on, the President of Mexico decided to go on tour to China and Australia, as they are important business partners. But it has been more than a month, and he has yet to visit Iguala, less than 5 hours drive from Mexico City. On November 7th, Mexico's Attorney General gave a press conference where he announced that according to some of those interrogated who showed signs of torture, they believed the students had been killed and burned. The parents refused to accept this information until reliable DNA sources are presented. When he thought the microphone was off, he told his aide to end the questions as he was tired. Ya me cansé.
Gracias. Ya me cansé.
We stand here today saying we are also tired. Tired of a government that cares more about macroeconomic deals than the security of its people. Tired of corruption. Tired of fighting a war on drugs that will only be solved when demand in the United States decreases. Tired of unsolvable crimes. The state has the responsibility to protect its population. We ask you to do 3 things. Write to your local Mexican embassy or consulate to demand justice. Attend local events in your area to create awareness. Spread the word. Mexican politicians cannot hide if the world is watching them.
We don't have a lot of time, but that's the gist of it. And I'm just gonna very quickly go over a timeline, and I'll try not to be that repetitive so that we can move forward. But I just want to kind of insist on the fact that this is not an isolated event. This is part of how there's a structural problem, both political, economic, and also social. So I'm going to list a series of events that are taking place and whose level of impunity is just speechless. And just to show that there are all different levels of the government having involved, and as well as different parties. So it's not only about the PRI, the PRI, the PRD, or one, right? All of them have had something to do with this. So like Rosana Reguillo, who is an expert on the topic, she will say like, we're talking about a 3 kind of tier system when politicians, criminals, and people who are supposed to defend us, like the military and the police, are involved. So we have Tlatlaya, Allende, Casino Royale, Guardería ABC, Atenco, and Acteal. And I just wanted to highlight 2 things. The first one is that both in Casino Royale, oh, I'm sorry, and Guardería BC there was a fire. And so just to highlight how these events, in many ways, were unnoticed, whereas when people said on fire, the door of the National Palace did not. And in Atenco, the incidents that happened there, Enrique Peña Nieto was actually the governor of the state, and this just kind of established the kind of impunity that we were to see later. And so just to point to some numbers, the New York editorial this week, actually last week, highlighted how 22,000 people have gone missing, have been disappeared. This is of course underreported, and the numbers are actually conservative to some degree. And then 100,000 deaths have happened since 2007. And La Jornada just a few days ago reported that 30,000 migrants have disappeared since 2006, and 100,000 people have been murdered, right? So let's think of La Bestia. And so these are events that actually get close to home when our relatives are actually involved with this. And not to mention San Fernando, the 72 Central Americans who were murdered or assassinated in Tamaulipas in 2010. So very briefly, we all know what happened at Ayotzinapa. Students were detained, gunned down by the local police, and so they were handed over to Guerreros Unidos, the local narco group. And as a result, 3 of them were killed, and 4 of them, and 3 other civilians who were there too. One of them who was football, soccer. And what's important to highlight is that in the search for these 43 missing students, more massacres were found, right? Not the actual students, and this is important to highlight once again, because who are these people, right? And so we still don't know who they are. Many of them, they identified them wanton priests. But whatever happened to the rest of the people? And just to clarify, 182 bodies were found up to August just in this year in massacres, plus 28 found in Iguala, and recently 15 more. So it's about like only Guerrero, 19 massacres, right? So let's keep that in mind. And what about the investigation that we heard on November 7? Jesus Murillo Caram gave his report of his scientific, without scientific evidence, of what happened to the students. And so what experts say, especially the forensic team from Argentina, whom the parents trust, they say like these allegations were not sustained, could not be sustained based on the evidence. And a professor, David Martinez Amador, said that it is impossible to incinerate 43 bodies in an open area, like the alleged drift where they were found, the students were found. And one has to take into account the rain report, 30 centimeters of rain that night where they were supposed to be being incinerated, right? So just this, it is a montage that we can tell, and it's also an offense to our sense of intelligence and humanity, to say the least. And like you saw in the video, who's responsible? Well, we think the government is responsible, especially since the government declared the war on drugs in 2006 during the presidency of Felipe Calderon, and it has continued until now. So our group has collected this evidence, 120,000 victims of this drug war, and 25 people have gone disappeared. And I want to insist that these numbers are quite conservative and underreported. And just because we are the United States, I want to remind us the ways in which we are kind of implicated, even indirectly, obviously not directly, by paying taxes to the US government, and the fact that the US has sponsored to some degree the violence in Mexico and throughout America, as all of you know. But just to talk about the Merida initiative that in 2008, the presidency of Bush proposed, and by 2009, just by 2009, November, the US government had given $14 million, right, to supposedly combat narcotraffic in Mexico. And one could wonder why there are so many protests. And there's something that has changed, and Yvonne and the rest of the panelists will talk about this. And it has to do with the fact that it's no longer that the victims, before they were like presumed guilty, right? They were víctimas culpables, and that they were distant, like it happened in Allende, it happened in Actial, it happened home. And something had changed. So this violence is actually reaching out to us as students, and my colleague Edwin will talk about that. They studying for something that encompasses all of us, because they were poor peasants and indigenous in some cases. So Rosana Arguillo once again talks about two kinds of violence. One of them is the disciplined violence, and the other one is the diffuse violence. So we don't know from where we're going to be attacked, and the disciplined violence has to do with what happens when you protest, that you go missing, that you are disappeared. And I want to finish my intervention with a quote from Angela Davis, who's an African American activist and feminist, who said that one does not have to be an expert to fight for justice. Oftentimes we feel like we can't be invested or get involved because we don't know enough about what's going on. But it is a matter of justice. And I want to finish my intervention with this. Ayotzinapa, Palestina, Ferguson, mi barrio, tu barrio. Our university, nuestra universidad, are all a matter of justice. Thank you.
Hello. When the 46th anniversary of the 1968 student massacre in Mexico was commemorated this past October 2nd, few could fail to notice the tragic irony of the moment. The killing and disappearance of students from the Ayotzinapa Teachers College in the state of Guerrero meant that there was nothing to commemorate. That brutal state violence was ongoing, not a thing of the past. The 2 de Octubre march was indeed missing 43. Ayotzinapa students had been attacked in Iguala precisely as they gathered funds to travel to the 68 commemorative march in Mexico City. At first glance, this is a local story, a small town mayor, a municipal police force in cahoots with the local cartel. But of course, that's just at first glance. It speaks, of course, to the level of state saturation of organized crime, the tolerance and tacit complicity of government at state and federal levels, issues that have been and will be covered by other speakers here. What I want to point out to here is the broader socioeconomic conditions in which the attack and the Normalista movement itself was taking place in. First of all, the mayor was not taking decisions in a vacuum, but in a general climate of hostility against Normalistas and teacher activism in general that has permeated many sectors of Mexican society for years now. Teachers' colleges, particularly rural ones, and teachers' unions have been at the forefront of the fight against neoliberal restructuring, using increasingly militant tactics. In the discourse of the state, a discourse that's reproduced by mainstream media, these groups are seen as violent, as parasitical groups, as groups with irrational demands, sort of intense version of the anti-union, anti-teacher sentiment that sometimes exists in the US. In Mexico, these accusations often have a classist and sometimes racist undertone. The image they present is of an unruly, backward mob. Take as examples a couple of cartoons here from mainstream newspapers. This is all from the same cartoonist. Here, these teacher unions are presented as thugs, as sort of hard-headed criminals on par with the drug traffickers and the communitarian police, which is deliberately misspelled to sort of signal their low levels of education. Or, in this case, a sort of disheveled insect-looking, sort of dehumanized creatures. It was the same climate of stigmatization that allowed for normalistas from Ayotzinapa to be attacked beforehand in 2007 and in 2011, actually, when blocking a major highway in demand for jobs and for better living conditions in their own institution. Police opened fire, killing 2 students. As the normalistas made an escape, they lit fire to a gas station, and tragically the attendant of the gas station died as he tried to put out the flames. But why was this increased militancy taking place, I think is an important question to be posed. If 1968 was a movement of the children of an expanding middle class seeking to transform their economic gains into political gains, the current student movements are about defending the little that's left. The little that's left of the rights and benefits won in the post-revolutionary phase. In other words, this moment is not a moment of expansion of rights. It's a moment of defense. It's a moment of trying to hold on to previous historical victories. The past decades have witnessed how traditional venues of outward mobility for lower and lower middle classes have been gradually closing. Rural teaching colleges, for example, are down to half of the number that existed in the 1950s. And students live in terrible living conditions. This is a picture of one of the dorms at Ayotzinapa. So the state is waging a war of attrition here, and they're fighting back. The pressure on normales happens in the context of downward pressure throughout. The past decades of neoliberal restructuring have meant that low-ranking government jobs, which were a source of stable employment, have cut down on benefits that used to make up for low wages. Public universities deny admissions to tens of thousands of students each year. Aspiring students in the past have undertaken marches, sit-ins, other desperate measures to secure a spot, even as the certainty of a relatively good job after graduation declines. There is then a deep connection between the normalista movement of the past years and the Politécnico struggle of this year. I don't have time to go into it, but just very briefly, I mean, the main demand of the struggle in the Politécnico was to cancel a proposal for the university to offer a technical degree that would devaluate or compete with their engineering degree. So they're fighting against this. They're fighting against this impending precarious condition. And the same can be said about the 132 2 years ago. It was a middle class movement in a general sense, but let me go into a couple of numbers. And I apologize if this is sort of too academic, but according to the National Institute of Statistics, Mexico has a relatively low unemployment rate, so between 5 and 6%. But this is very misleading because a whopping 30% by the most conservative count are part of the informal sector, right? A percentage sector that has been increasing in the past 10 years. People in the informal sector aren't necessarily low income. In fact, 60% are not. But they have to cope with extreme insecurity. Income is not stable. No quality health care, no retirement pension, no career to be made. More to the point, unemployment for those under 30 is almost at double the national rate. And people with formal higher education bear a big part of the brunt. Close to 40% of unemployed have at least a high school degree compared to those with only an elementary school education, which account for 8% of the unemployed. So unemployment hits people with higher formal education in a stronger way. Unsurprisingly, surveys by the polling agency Mitowski found in September 2011 that 80% of respondents thought their economic situation had worsened when compared to the previous year, and 70% expected their situation to grow worse in the years to come. This is the context in which the normalista movement was taking place. It is the context in which the current uproar is taking place. As weeks go by, the hope of finding them alive diminishes. The gruesome discovery of mass graves in the vicinity prompts us to expect the worst. The international image promoted by Peña Nieto of a Mexican moment is tarnished. And as investigations drag on, it becomes clear that Ayotzinapa is a turning point. Because if 1968 meant the death of that movement, Ayotzinapa 2014 is actually the beginning of the movement.
So good afternoon, everyone. Iguala from the Spanish and Portuguese department. And I think I'm going to have to, I don't have to, but it just happens that I'm going to repeat some of the issues that Esther, Edwin, and Manuel already raised. So what I'm going to try to do today is to try to explain two issues. Why Ayotzinapa has produced the reaction that it has, above all in Mexico, but also abroad, and to think about what it means for the future of the country that Ayotzinapa is a crime of state. As we all know, Mexico is not lacking in events that should have generated similar outrage, and Manuel already pointed out to some of them. Guarderías ABC, the women in Ciudad Juárez, the women now in el Estado de México, the 72 Central American immigrants of San Fernando, the list is long, and probably you know it as well as I do. And yet, the response to this case only has one recent parallel, that of the marches and demonstrations after the Zapatista uprising in 1994. So, if Mexico has had plenty of reason to pour out into the streets to demand justice, why the outrage now? Why only now? And Edwin already remarked why, no? But I think that it is because of a series of historical layers, in addition to other factors that I will address. So layers, historical layers that converge in this case. To begin with, I think there is the question of the anger at the dismantling of the Constitution recently achieved by the Mexican state. Most of the recent reforms undo what the revolution had painfully achieved. Particularly important are those to the energy sector, oil especially. Other reforms have focused on land tenure and the education system. And we might think that the achievements of the revolution inscribed in the Constitution were merely on paper and not important. And we know that in Mexico there is a big gap between law and reality. But if the political class in power strove so hard to change it, it's because it meant something. Before, at least, Mexicans had a document, a mighty document, that they could appeal to say it's in the Constitution, this is illegal. But now, what should always be illegal, for example, dispossessing land from communities on the basis of their land holding oil, has become legal. So this is very interesting, and Estelle and I were working together over the summer on a paper on this, no? That now what should be illegal is legal in the Constitution. Then, in September, the students from the Politécnico started to protest over changes to their plan de estudios, which would, in their view, what Edwin already said, train them to be technicians or cheap labor rather than scientists. They considered the government's proposal to be in keeping with the neoliberal economic reforms to the Constitution. And with this, a student movement emerged. So, to this recent historical reversals threatening, among many other things, the education of thousands of young people, we have to add the active disregard of the state for the life of many people. Tlatlaya, another crime of state, comes to mind. So, in the midst of all of this, Ayotzinapa happened. And as Manuel and Edwin have indicated, these people were attacked precisely because they represent a struggle that perhaps still believes in the repeatedly broken promises of the revolution. That education should be free and available to all, and perhaps it's important to remember this at Berkeley today. No? We believe in that, and we believe in that too. No? Education should be free, especially to those in rural areas or in poor areas. And we also believe that inequality should be fought. that we all are equal. In this sense, they could have been considered the normalistas, political antagonists to the economic system the state represents. But in another sense, their social class, their connections to indigenous communities, reminds us of another great imbalance in Mexico. And this other imbalance has to do not with the layer of the revolution, but with the colonial period. And it makes me uncomfortable to talk about this, but I think it's necessary, because what is at stake here is the definition of what is human. Who is a human being and who is not? And I'm thinking about Julio César Mondragón, the normalista who was brutally tortured with cold precision and expertise, not the methods used by drug dealers. So what they did to him presents us all with a mirror. Are we human? Was he human? And are the people who did this to him, the policemen, while the army watched, supposedly, are they human? Or to make this a little bit less abstract, who are Mexicans? What are Mexicans made of that this can be done to a young man, a student, and we continue to go on with our lives as if nothing had happened? But it did happen. They did that to him. And I think that intuitively, we all know that we owe it to him and to the other 2 students killed, the 43 missing students, and to the thousands of others disappeared or killed in the last 8 years. We owe it to all of them to stop a system that has had Mexican people on their knees saying amen time and again to a state that either kills or commands to kill, or that by not doing anything about it, creates the conditions for the continuation, the unending repetition of these events. So in Ayotzinapa, not only have unresolved historical struggles converged, but also the exhibition in all of its nakedness of the fact that the rule of law in Mexico is a farce. Lorenzo Meyer recently remarked about the state in Mexico. He said about it that it holds the monopoly over legal violence, but also over illegal violence. And the question is, of course, what kind of state is this, and what kind of people would allow that? So Ayotzinapa and Tlatlaya, are therefore crimes of state, not only because of the people who carried them out, the police, the active and passive presence of the army in both, but even more so because if they were not crimes of state, there wouldn't be now, as there is in both cases, a massive attempt to cover them up. The demonstrations then have to do with the demand for a real solution. The question is, can Ayotzinapa be solved? Can the rule of law be established? The simple question has no easy answer because it points to the great paradox shared by the government and by those who are now marching demanding the rule of law. Because something as basic as that, the rule of law, because no one is asking for anything radical, no one is asking for a guillotine of sorts, for example, we just want the rule of law. But were the state to make sure justice were served, it would have to investigate many key figures in the government, too many perhaps, so that in order to establish the rule of law, the state would have to dismantle itself. And we know that states usually don't do that. Then, what do we mean when we demand the rule of law? What does it entail if the state that could and should produce it is not going to? And it would be great, and I think that we all would be happy if tomorrow we would see that the Mexican government is doing what it needs to do in order to solve this. I just don't think it's going to happen. But if they do, great. So to wait for the next elections seems like an equally far-fetched solution. Contrary to what many people think, and probably you have heard that as Andrés Manuel López Obrador is behind of all of this, or the people who want power, they're all orchestrating this. No, but contrary to that, I think that it's clear for most people who participate in this movement that PRI, PAN, PRD, and even Morena are either complicit or too set in their ways to be able to respond to this major crisis. But since I don't want to end with this bleak panorama, I'll speak about civil society, about the many possible connections created by a state that has been either too strong or too weak, depending on its interest. The connections between the families and the classmates of the 43 normalistas with the ZLN, Atenco, Cherán, with the student movement that has become one of its strongest supporters. So many possibilities there. And as many people have been saying, only civil society has any legitimacy to push for real necessary changes. Changes that would not be cursory, band-aid, or band-aid, I don't know how you say it, band-aid? Band-aid? Well, curitas, no? Band-aid type of reforms. But changes important enough that would allow, no? So we need changes that would allow, in a Benjaminian sense, that no matter what, the 43 students and thousands of others would finally return home safely. And if you haven't read Walter Benjamin, it would be really important to read him now. It's powerful stuff and very necessary for this crisis. So the task is enormous because in Mexico, people have to start as if from zero. Nothing can be taken for granted. And the struggle has two levels. Most societies need to worry only about one of them. The first one is the right not to be killed in horrible ways by the government and its associates, be they corporations, mining, logging companies, or drug cartels. It's all the same. No? And the second one is the need to organize itself and construct a political platform aiming at real social justice by starting with the dismantling of an economic system that produces absurd, grotesque inequality. A fact that to me is at the foundation of everything that is wrong with Mexico. This will take a long time for sure, and it will necessitate a takeover of the state, a whole different state from the one that Mexico has now. But control of the state seems crucial in the long run because we have already seen how dangerous it is to leave it to people who care very little about others. I think that thousands, hopefully millions of us in Mexico and abroad and are right now witnessing in all of this movement the beginning of the end.
That mic doesn't work. Just one moment.
No, ese no es.
Tengo que dejar los dos. Ese es para live stream. Okay, hi. My name is Richard Vijada. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Rhetoric. I've been asked to speak about the U.S. media coverage of the events surrounding Ayotzinapa and its political fallout. I'm not going to engage in an eloquent deconstruction as Yvonne did, because I think the field is a little bit different. And so, or the field that I'm looking at is a little bit different. So to that end, I just want to add a couple of sort of prefatory remarks. This is sort of a first stab at news analysis, because for all of the coverage that we're seeing in the Anglophone media, it's very short on news analysis. We're not seeing a review of how the news is being produced, who it's for, and why that should matter. And because we have such a fragmented media landscape, it's very difficult to, at times, get a sense for who's hearing this and why the listeners of these, or why the people consuming such media matter in thinking about analyzing the media. So later on, I'll be posting a PowerPoint with some resources to look to just for some basic, getting caught up news. on the situation in Mexico. Okay, so the rough timeline of American news coverage, say starting from Ayotzinapa, or starting from the Iguala massacre on September 29th, was very slim. It kind of started off with a very, very brief comment. It was actually a 143-word report coming in from Mexico City for the New York Times. And it started off with the sentence, in the Mexican state of Guerrero, one of the most violent, ... 43 people or 6 students were murdered and 43 were abducted. And a lot of the media coverage just around the disappearances was rather slim. It wasn't really until November 6th, or after November 6th, and the first major demonstrations, and also the announcement by Murió Caram, Ya me cansé, right, that really provoked, and the first sort of official government reports from on Ayotzinapa, however reliable as they were or not, then that's when the American media, or the Anglophone media, really sort of started stepping up. And with the discovery of these further unmarked mass graves that were not holding any of the normalistas, it began to raise more and more questions. So since November 6th, we've been seeing a much more sustained round of coverage throughout what I'm going to sort of categorize in about 5 or 6 different rough categories. And I'm saying these provisionally, not with any certainty. So on the first, you have the literary press, or sort of the highbrow literature and culture magazines, places like the New Yorker, or the New York Review of Books, where you have someone like Francisco Goldman, a fantastic writer, and he's now filing occasional dispatches under the headline "The Crisis in Mexico," he finishes off his second report, in which he asks out loud, could the 43 missing students spark a revolution? And he finishes with this particular line: "It is also possible that the path to solving Mexico's problems need not be so drastic. Flawed and abused as it has been, the country is still a democracy. It continues to have elections which occur under the scrutiny of the international press, for whatever that's worth, and election monitors. In 2000, Mexican voters finally put an end to the 71 years of authoritarian and corrupt PRI rule, only to turn the government over to a rightist party, the National Action Party, the PAN, which ended up, at the behest of the United States, plunging the country into the narco war, the results of which we are all living now. Mexicans now have another chance to politically reinvent their country. Now is the new time for new leaders and even new parties to emerge from the civic movements and from outside the discredited political establishment. What many Mexicans have been telling me is this: it's either now or never." End quote. So that's sort of the general sense, sort of conveys some of the general sense that's been coming out of at least these highbrow press outlets. Thing is, who's listening to this and why? Because when you start moving on to sort of different categories, such as, say, global newspapers, or, and by that I mean sort of the New York Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, and The Economist, and even Foreign Policy, a whole different set of issues sort of start popping up. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. Because when you have the Economist, which is no sort of revolutionary paper, right, giving recommendations to end impunity, you can't help but raise your eyebrows. And I quote, and this is under the headline, "How to End Impunity," or "Saving a Promising Presidency." Mr. Peña's people rightly say that the rule of law cannot be imposed in Mexico overnight, but that is no excuse for inaction today. Iguala is not the only town where criminals run the police. In such places, the federal government should take temporary control of the police and administration. I mean, anybody who's sort of figuring out what's going on at this point, at least in Mexico, knows that's kind of already happened. Mr. Peña should lead an effort to clean up state police forces and local courts. A bill to make the Attorney General's office independent and to create an anti-corruption agency should be fast-tracked. Federalism in Mexico needs change as well. States and municipalities raise almost no funds of their own and are not held to account for their spending. It is an indictment of all three main political parties that the elements in Mr. Peña's reform pact to make politicians accountable have yet to be approved. Now it's time for him to prove, for Peña Nieto to prove his critics wrong. It kind of, at least from my cynical perspective, seems like wishful thinking. Because there's a lot more at play and at stake, which I think somebody like the editors of The Economist aren't willing to really consider. And some of those have been considered by people like Greg Grandin, who in his most recent issue, in one of the more recent issues of the Nation, brings up a couple of really salient points connecting the United States into the picture. And the name of this particular article was, this mass grave isn't the mass grave you've been looking for. After these killings, quote, the Catholic priest Raúl Verán Alejandro Solarienda blamed all three levels of Mexico's government for the deaths, local, state, and federal. They also blamed the United States, saying its immigration and drug war policy was responsible for the deaths. They demanded the suspension of Plan Mérida, or the Mérida Initiative. Laura Carlson, another journalist, says that, quote, besides the nearly $3 billion that's come through the Mérida Initiative, there's also Department of Defense money. And that money is going to train police forces and armed forces that now we find are directly involved in attacks on the people, and particularly attacks on the youth, end quote. It is possible, Carlson said, that the Iguala police, who seem to be operationally indistinguishable from the Guerreros Unidos, which were one of the factions allegedly at work in Guerrero, received financing from these programs. Others have accused the military. Charles Bowden called the Mexican army, recipient of millions of dollars of Washington aid, quote, the biggest cartel in Mexico, end quote. Now, this is The Nation, which is sort of one of the country's leading left newspapers. But how much of that is preaching to the choir? How much of it is that which we already know? The same goes for The Guardian, who's actually been producing very high quality reportage coming out of Mexico and on a quite consistent basis since the killings, and even beforehand. And in fact, that particular quote from Charles Bowden is cited from The Guardian. And so that is also a really, also Joe Tuckerman's coverage in The Guardian is really top-notch. I think it's one of the few places you can go to at least get a broader sense for what's going on and what's at stake. So those are more or less the major sort of broadsheet news, daily or weekly newspapers. We also have network and mainstream media. Sort of your TV, your Foxes, CBS's, NBC's, MSNBC, so on and so forth. And this is where it gets, again, even trickier. Because a lot of the narrative, at least among major media outlets, has to do with violence. Whether it has to do with the killing, or it has to do with the political violence that's purportedly taking place in Mexico City, or even sort of the student burnings of the state houses. But that's what they'll focus on with little context, or little way in to sort of contextualize the story. What's really fascinating, though, is that there are places like MSNBC which sort of bifurcate their coverage. And this happens a lot in the bilingual press. There's a gentleman on MSNBC who I didn't know existed. His name is Jose Diaz-Balart, and he has a morning show on MSNBC. But it's really kind of the only place you hear sort of in-depth coverage about what's going on. Actually, they have man on the street interviews and so on. But what's interesting is that, and also sort of with Univision and Spanish language media, a lot of it is very much driven towards a demographic. It's not sort of a task of general diffusion or general sort of edification as to why this is important. If you're interested in it, you can go see José Díaz Balart, and they have very good in-depth coverage. The problem is that, again, who's listening and who is this structured for? Spanish language media has been very much on top of things, and they actually revealed one of the Spanish language media is revealing several of the very interesting connections between Ayotzinapa and Mexicans living in the United States. For example, we have the story of Jacinto Galindo, who is the father of one of the normalistas in San. He lives in San Jose, and his story is now sort of becoming a way by which people are beginning to realize that Ayotzinapa is not very far away anymore. That this, what was originally sort of what we thought was a little village out in the middle of nowhere, right, is now at our doorstep. Because there are families who are concerned, there are families who are grieving, there are families who are very much, and Mexicans and Mexican Americans, who are very concerned about what's going on here and going on in Mexico. And the last bit is alternative press. And we'll be speaking with Daniel Hernandez a little bit later, but I consider Vice Media, despite the fact that they have tons of Viacom money, to be sort of a somewhat outsider source. But they're doing extensive coverage with very good timelines, as is Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Has now been sort of doing a lot of work in kind of small-scale broadcasts. But again, I ask, who is this for, and who's listening, and how does this fragmented media landscape actually promote dialogue, or does it reinforce pre-existing views? So with that, I just wanted to reiterate the main point that I wanted to give was that there's so much news, it's really hard to give solid news analysis. And the thing that's been really been wanting with respect to Ayotzinapa, and then the political fallout, because the way that the reportage makes it is that you have all of a sudden, the killings, you have the capture of Héctor Beltrán Leiva, you have the Ya Me Cansé moment, you have the demonstrations, you have but there's nobody connecting the dots, which is what's really frustrating. And I would submit to you that it's in the interest of connecting the dots that news analysis would be very necessary to be able to make a persuasive case for why we should be concerned about Ayotzinapa and why others should be concerned. Not just Mexican American communities or Mexican communities in the United States, but that it becomes an issue by which a broader political debate can begin to emerge. You are now having the media starting to recognize that Latinos in the U.S. are very concerned about what's going on in Mexico. And on the other side, you have some people that are very wary of that. Some people are very wary of this increased attention. It's like, well, yes, you can be concerned just as long as you don't, mess things up. So, with that, I would say I'll put up some links on the groups on the event Facebook page that have some really fantastic timelines that just have this extensive list of coverage from different media outlets. As always, buyer beware. And it's up to us to really do a lot of that dot connecting, have those conversations so that we can all connect the dots in a broader political debate together. So thank you.
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Víctor Vich, soy profesor visitante este semestre aquí en Berkeley. Bueno, pues como todos, quiero comenzar diciendo que este crimen es muy doloroso, nos duele mucho, y nos duele no solamente por la atrocidad de lo que ha ocurrido, sino porque se trata de un patrón que se repite y que se repite una y otra vez en la historia de América Latina. En América Latina, en nuestro continente, la historia suele repetirse como tragedia. El problema es que más allá de la farsa que siempre está detrás, una tragedia dolorosa y honda se repite una y otra vez. A lo largo del siglo pasado, del siglo XX, y de este que ha comenzado, los políticos y los militares en América Latina no se han cansado de detener a estudiantes, de torturarlos, de desaparecerlos y de matarlos impunemente. Una parte de la historia de América Latina es la historia de estos hechos, y sobre todo de estos hechos ocurridos durante dictaduras. El problema es que el caso de Ayotzinapa ha ocurrido en una democracia, aunque ya sabemos que las democracias actuales no son tan distintas de los viejos gobiernos autoritarios. El problema es que los que mueren, aquellos que el Estado mata, aquellos que el Estado siempre mata, son sobre todo ciudadanos que viven en lugares alejados, muchas veces rurales, que algunos consideran que tienen menos derechos que los demás. Y creo por eso que es importante situar lo que ha ocurrido en una perspectiva histórica, observando cómo ese patrón se ha repetido siempre en América Latina y en el mundo entero. Y por eso quiero contar brevísimamente un caso parecido y reciente ocurrido en América Latina. Ocurrió en el Perú en 1992. En ese momento, el Perú vivía una situación de extrema violencia, producto de dos grupos terroristas, ¿sí? Dos grupos terroristas que se habían alzado en armas, pero también de un Estado que los imitaba en casi todas sus prácticas. Luego de un cruel atentado que Sendero Luminoso perpetuó en las calles de Lima, el Servicio Nacional de Inteligencia informó que dicho atentado había sido organizado en una universidad peruana, había sido planeado en una universidad peruana, conocida con el nombre de La Cantuta, porque el campus de la universidad está rodeado de muchos árboles que tienen esa flor. La Cantuta es una hermosísima flor roja que aflora en los Andes peruanos y que el Inca Garcilaso describe con detalle en varias páginas. El punto es que 2 días después de ese atentado que se produjo en las calles de Lima por parte de Sendero Luminoso, un comando del ejército peruano entró a la Universidad La Cantuta y detuvo a un profesor y a 9 estudiantes. Se los llevaron en unas camionetas cerradas y los fusilaron esa misma noche. Los enterraron en unos cerros muy lejos de la universidad. Los familiares preguntaron, pero el gobierno siempre negó los hechos. Se dijo inclusive, el presidente dijo inclusive, que los estudiantes se habían autosecuestrado y que algunos de ellos se habían ido a pelear con Sendero Luminoso. Los familiares insistieron una y otra vez. La presión fue cada vez mayor y 1 año después, los militares, asustados de que todo salga a la luz, desenterraron los cuerpos en la noche, los sacaron de ese lugar y volvieron a enterrarlos en un basural lejísimos de la ciudad de Lima. Sin embargo, alguien los vio ahí, un viejo reciclador que logró esconderse detrás de una gran piedra en un cerro. Ese personaje tiene una historia fascinante, que no puedo contar ahora, era un viejo militante político. y lo que hizo fue dibujar un plano mostrando dónde estaba exactamente el nuevo lugar de la fosa y llevarlo a una radio, que a su vez esta radio lo entregó a un congresista de la República. El escándalo fue muy grande cuando el fiscal fue al lugar y encontraron los cuerpos ahí enterrados. Pero al gobierno no le importó lo sucedido y al día siguiente, como reacción al hecho, declaró la ley de amnistía para todos los militares acusados de violaciones de derechos humanos. Al día siguiente de la ley, al día siguiente de la ley, un artista peruano indignado se dirigió al cerro donde encontraron los cuerpos y dibujó ahí en el cerro 10 cantutas rojas. No solo les construyó una tumba, sino que si el Estado convirtió ese cerro en un basural de cuerpos humanos, el artista quiso sacralizar ese espacio y entregarle al Estado otra cosa, distinta a la de la muerte. Una imagen que afirma que todavía la belleza y el bien puede ser posible. La historia es indignante y muy larga, pero lo cierto es que hubo un actor que nunca se rindió en esta lucha y fueron efectivamente los familiares de los 9 estudiantes y del profesor desaparecido. Una y otra vez pidieron justicia, una y otra vez fracasaron, una y otra vez tuvieron que regresar a sus casas con las manos en los bolsillos llenos de indignación, pero nunca se rindieron. A pesar de los fracasos, a pesar de las causas perdidas, los padres de los estudiantes estuvieron protestando siempre, pidiendo explicaciones y exigiendo justicia. Hoy, Alberto Fujimori, expresidente de la República del Perú, se encuentra preso por dicho delito, por la muerte de esos 9 estudiantes y ese profesor. En un juicio impecable se demostró que las órdenes de matarlos salieron del propio Palacio de Gobierno y se demostró además que los estudiantes no eran militantes de la agrupación terrorista. Hoy Fujimori está condenado a 25 años de prisión por ese crimen de lesa humanidad. Esperemos que esta historia sí vuelva a repetirse. Solo nos queda continuar luchando para que esa victoria de la justicia contra la impunidad pueda continuar repitiéndose en América Latina. Muchas gracias.
I'll put you on in just a moment, but I'm going to introduce you and set up the trailer. All right, hang on one second. So on the line with me is Daniel Hernandez. He is currently the Mexico Bureau Chief for Vice News. And he's been in Mexico City since 2007. He's done work with several media outlets alongside of Vice, including Current, the LA Times, the LA Weekly, among others. He's a 2001 graduate of the University of California, Berkeley. He was also the editor-in-chief of the Daily Cal in his senior year. He's also the author of a book called Down and Delirious in Mexico City, the Aztec Metropolis in the 21st Century, which came out about 2 or 3 years ago. And now he's in the process of producing for Vice Media, or for Vice News, The Missing 43. Mexico's disappeared students, of which we'll show you a trailer, and then we'll have a phone interview with him shortly. Hopefully we don't get an ad.
Creo que es una fosa que encontramos aquí. Le estamos excavando, vimos que estaba ancho. A lo mejor hay alguien ahí enterrado.
Right now, thousands of people have gathered to protest the disappearance of 43 teaching students in the southern state of Guerrero and the killing of 6 others.
Pues yo creo que este caso viene a evidenciar el México real y todos estos hechos están marcados por la impunidad. Estamos hablando de que los cuerpos estuvieron tirados, los heridos estuvieron desangrándose por más de 5 horas. Obviamente cada día también surgen más fosas donde la delincuencia organizada ejecutaba cientos de personas y las iban a sepultar ahí.
Bueno, para nosotros aquí en el Estado no es nuevo que el gobierno esté infiltrado o el narco esté infiltrado con el gobierno. Posiblemente no hayan cometido el error que cometieron hoy en matar y desaparecer a estudiantes, porque hoy sabemos que es un delito perpetrado por el Estado, porque son policías los que se lo llevaron.
Daniel Hernandez, hello, welcome. Oh, hello. Oh, hang on one sec. Let me get your. You might. Creo que tengo que descansar este año. Hello. Oh, that's fine. Oh, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Daniel. So everyone, can you hear Daniel? Yes. Okay, so we're up here at Dwinell Hall 370, and
What's up, Dwinell? What's up, Dwinell Hall?
it's a gray, wet and rainy day out here, but we're all here to hear what the latest is from you here over in Mexico City, and also the general, what your perception is of the general tone throughout the DF, Guerrero, and throughout.
Well, right now it's pretty calm. It's been pretty calm since this weekend. Tomorrow there's a big demonstration planned to mark the Day of the Revolution. This is on November 20th. Usually this is a military parade. Just today, the government announced that the military parade would not be happening, so that they would allow the protests to happen. So that was sort of very significant that happened today related to the ongoing protests. And while we've seen this before in Mexico, protests like this happened in 2011. They happened in years before, and what's happened now is just sort of another cycle in this constant clamor for some kind of justice for average people in Mexico. In Guerrero, we were there basically in a row, four times in about 5 weeks. And we were in Iguala, in Cocula, in Chilpancingo, myself and the crew here from Vice News here in Mexico City. And it's tense, is the short answer to that, because everything is tranquil and fine in Mexico. Like a lot of people might know that sensation that, once you get here, it's so tranquil and fine and peaceful. And yet, at any moment, anything can pop off and happen. And you just don't want to be in that place, in that moment. And unfortunately, too many people are, So that is the latest. We're just waiting for tomorrow to see kind of what the mood will be there. There was this fire situation that happened at the National Palace at one of the recent demonstrations that took it to a different place that the protests haven't been. They've been mostly peaceful, completely peaceful, organized. Their families, their old people, their students, of course. But we'll see if things will kind of be a little more calmer, or if there will still be this level of anger and of just kind of the outrage that people are expressing on the streets.
So you were mentioning that you were with your crew in Guerrero. Have you had a chance to meet with the parents and the normalistas and some of their fellow students? And if you have, how are their spirits, and what have you learned from speaking with them?
Well, it's always a pleasure to get to talk to campesinos in Mexico when we're living in a highly urban place like Mexico City or any other big city. What we found from talking to these families and relatives is that, they have the hopes and the dreams and the desires of, anyone else, and they're aware of sort of their situation in Mexico. Incredible resources and incredible richness of culture and of agricultural resources for one that the government is just completely neglected or permitted to fall into near collapse, the small agricultural economy in Mexico. So these kids, they really represented a hope for their families, and so it was very traumatic, obviously, and they're just very, they're broken, they're incredibly sad, but they're very strong at the same time. And they've been there enduring, interviews all day with press that are coming from all over the world, which itself takes a toll on people. And we were very perceptive and aware of that and didn't want to be in their faces unnecessarily, but at the same time they're there kind of responding to these requests. And there's nowhere really else for them to go. They're committed to getting their kids back alive, and so they're just, as a group now, and they're obviously very angry. And they're saying that they know that this was the government that did this crime, and that many of them even said that they were ready to take up arms to make their point and to be heard. And that is a statement that is not taken lightly in Guerrero, because Guerrero has a history of guerrilla activity and guerrilla forces and armies that have grown over the years. We know who knows what's going to happen, but the point is they're angry and they're not tired. They're not going to give up.
And also, recently the Zapatistas have come out expressing their support for the normalistas. How have people in Guerrero responded to the solidarity efforts of other groups, both in Mexico and outside the country?
Well, just really on the topic of how they're responding, they're super aware that this has become an international protest and that there have been solidarity demonstrations all over the world. And it's very surprising to me, even after living here in Mexico and realizing that Mexicans are very good at migrating, and so there are Mexicanos all over the world in every country. And in many of these cities where Mexicanos live now, they've come out and demonstrated, even if it's a handful of people, even if it's 5 people in Toronto, or a handful of people in a small city in Brazil, or people are expressing, the solidarity with what all of Mexico is going through. And this is the Ayotzinapa case is almost just like a small, not a small, obviously, but it's just this one case, this one straw, this huge pile, and that's what's really present in people's minds, is that it's broader. In terms of the Zapatista response, well, I think that was bound to happen. The Zapatistas always express solidarity with when situations like this and any kind of realm happen in Mexico, and we'll see if anything more concrete happens in that area.
And what's been the what kind of talk have you been hearing about the role of the sort of tacit inaction of the or outright support of the Mexican military forces by the United States?
By the United States, sorry?
Or just are you hearing any kind of any kind of feedback from protesters thinking about the role or the implications or the way that the United States is implicated by offering military aid or other material support?
Well, I think that's just to me, it's like a logical conclusion of this, or a logical probable solution to this crisis. Questioning, at least putting it on the table. Weeks went by before the question of the U.S. Support of Mexico's military campaign against the cartels is a wise policy to keep supporting, and that's just not really I think it's up to the people there in the room with you and to the people who are gathering for these kinds of events in other parts of the United States. It obviously is a factor to the lack of security and the inability for the institutions to respond to a threat that is as powerful as just, gangs of people who in many cases know their option to better themselves other than to maybe to migrate to the United States, to develop these complex, powerful, political, drug trafficking organizations. They are a product, of this whole, enforcement and prohibition structure. I mean, that's just the way I see it from reporting these things out in different areas, but it's just kind of my point of view, and I think it's up to, people questioning whatever way that they can.
Now, how is all this political fallout relating to other issues or previously articulated issues regarding violence in Mexico, especially the femicides?
Well, that is obviously another good question and another troubling area. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Actually, we can forego this and start taking questions from the audience, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody have a question that you'd like to ask Daniel? Yes.
Is that just teachers, or is it casinos? Like who's supporting?
So the question was, who else is supporting the normalistas in Guerrero?
In Guerrero or
Yeah, the major primary support in Guerrero right now is the Guerrero Teachers Union, that's the Sept. They are like the Sección 22 for Oaxaca. One of the more radical or more kind of like direct action oriented teachers unions right now in Mexico. Beyond that, there's just a lot of civilian groups that are coming in and bringing, supplies, liberos, donations. People finally the parents finally were willing to accept cash donations. I mean, mostly they're like, we're receiving canned goods and stuff, and other foods that they just receive so much, and at the same time they have other families, they have other kids that they have to take care of, and this crisis is obviously affecting them in all kinds of ways. So there's a variety of support, but it's mostly the teachers union in Guerrero.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, in the back?
¿Cómo ha sido la respuesta de los gobiernos locales y cómo ha tomado el pueblo esa respuesta?
So the question was how the state and local authorities have been responding to this, to the crisis, and how in turn have the local communities been responding?
Well, I would say that's part of the tension. In these communities where the drug cartels have created so much, have kind of taken control of this vacuum of power and have just created a whole structure around the fear of being, executed if you don't do what they ask you to. People are obviously still kind of taking, not taking sides, but thinking about their livelihood. On the other hand, there's also so much outrage even in Guerrero. Guerrero is kind of like a very socially minded, socially conscious state. It is the second poorest state in Mexico. It's a heavily indigenous state, but it's also a state where there's a lot of generalized public consciousness, I would say, at least a little bit, like Lucio Cabañas and the history of guerrilla social resistance, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, people are, but that's part of the tension. There's still a little bit of division, Meanwhile, the police, while they're trying to put their best face, everything is very calm right now. They don't want to attract any more attention, obviously. Mexico's federal government is obviously dealing with the worst PR crisis that they've had so far in the term of Peña Nieto. So I don't really see the police, radically changing and making a 180-degree turn. But, anything can happen really at any point. It can pop off again.
One last question, because Danielle's going to have to take off to finish production of the documentary. Wendy?
So for mainstream media, the main thing they've been picking up has been, for example, the burning of the door of the Palacio Nacional, which then we started seeing photos of it being related to the people being from the forces, the military forces. And then there was the UNAM case where it was the same person, right? Has he been at other places where these these infiltrations have been happening, or what has been the responses and what has been happening with all the violent stuff that's been happening in relation to infiltrators?
Okay, so last question has to do with how in your work you've been encountering agents provocateur, right, in demonstrations and in other events, especially events that wind up getting a lot of coverage in the mainstream media in the United States with little context.
Right. Well, that is a historical issue in Latin America, and it's definitely true here in Mexico. The issue with the door, the immediate response, any kind of, half-alive person in Mexico City is that was a provocateur kind of situation. At the same time, the anger is also very raw, So, for instance, in the Guerrero situation, when the students and the normalistas, the parents and members of the teachers union went to Iguala City Hall, they do sort of see it as part of their way to express their political indignation is to set fire to this building where this mayor was basically running a narco city in the interest of him and his wife and his family. They left. About an hour later, our photographer, Máximo Mosende, was witnessed and documented the way that another group of young men, mostly young men, masked, came in and looted the place and basically just destroyed it. These obviously were not the students. Does the press, does that message trickle back to the United States? No, it rarely does. We try as much as we can to always lay out as clear as possible who did what. But the predominant message there is fire, protesters say fire chaos in Mexico. And that is obviously an incomplete picture. So that's something that we try to confront, or at least we try to keep in mind while we're putting out these stories. But yes, it's an issue, and I think that in the coming weeks we're going to see it, because in 68, it's the exact same thing happening. That's why it's so freaky as just a student of basic modern Mexican history. There were all kinds of weird riots and attacks and burning, looting situations that occurred that clearly were not directly tied to the reform that the students at that time wanted.
Well, Daniel Hernandez, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and stay safe, and good luck with the remainder of the production. And I think all of us here are very grateful for your time and for your insight. So if you guys just give them a warm hand.
It feels great, and it really warms my heart to to a group of students read their account. So a big abrazo to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be online with you for a moment. Oh, there we go. Ahí estamos. All right, gracias.
We're just going to open up to discussion, questions that from the floor. Yeah.
Gracias a todos. Thank you, everybody. Like, this is really important, and what you've done here is just remarkable. I guess my question maybe is to everyone, and it's not a particularly academic question, but I've been finding in terms of organizing and media coverage, but that the overall response of who is indignant and who is getting involved and who is taking action is predominantly Mexican Americans, Mexicans, and other Latinos, and sort of what kinds of tactics, this is something that's like keeping me up at night, how in God's name do you get people who don't give a shit, which is the majority of the United States, how do you convince them to take action?
Wow.
I would like to answer that.
Yeah, please.
If possible.
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm sorry, guys. It's not that I want to interrupt. I actually want to apologize. Because I wanted to do a participation that kind of responds exactly what you wanted to say. But if you don't mind, I'm going to take 2 minutes for my intervention. If you don't mind, I apologize, guys. And I also apologize because I'm going to start talking about myself, which is something I wouldn't like to do. My name is Jorge. Good evening. I was born in this small city, large town in northern Mexico called Hermosillo, Sonora, on the desert of Arizona and Sonora, so northern Mexico, really hot place. I would never in my life forget the evening of June 5, 2009, and the months that followed that day. That evening, I was walking out of my office, regular day. I ran into another coworker, friend of mine, middle 40s. She was devastated, trying to explain to me that there has been this massive fire in a nearby child care center that we all have heard about. Guardería ABC child care. Well, you can imagine what that town was that night and the days that followed after these 49 babies were killed. 70 more were harmed. In one of these 49 babies was my very good friend Abraham Spraijo's daughter, Emilia. I'm sorry to bring this up, it kind of sucks, it might not do a lot of sense what year, but if you allow me to say, I will say that it makes a lot of sense for me to share this with you, because what I want to say is basically like, we as Mexicans, we've had it. It's not only Ayotzinapa, it's way bigger than Ayotzinapa. The guys right here have made it very clear, but we've freaking had it. It's too much. They've been messing with us economically for the last 2 or 3 decades. Oh, okay, that's right, we're like a humble people. But now they're fucking killing us. We've had it. So, considering this, and this is why I kind of interrupted, because I wanted to answer kind of this. Luckily, people in general in Mexico had it, so there's obviously something going on. I guess I found out about this excellent event in social network, like looking up, hey, what can I do if I want to support this? And this showed up, and tomorrow's event. And if I wanted to share this little short story with you guys, is because I want to be very clear on how important it is for Mexican society in general that you are like in smaller events, simpler actions like tomorrow's walking from City Hall to campus, and I believe there's another event in San Francisco. If each of one goes there and brings 3 people, that has such a huge power in Mexico right now. So I just wanted to say, please do not underestimate the power and the strength of your presence tomorrow 11:30, Berkeley City Hall. I'm not sure if it's at 4 in Powell in San Francisco. It is so important, especially tomorrow. Please be there. Any video that you share on social network is like very, very powerful. Mexican society needs from your help all over the world. Like, it's very important for us to be being watched and supported by the world. So I do guess, like Yvonne said, hopefully this is going to be the end, the beginning of the end. If we're all there tomorrow, that's going to help at least a little. Thank you guys. I'm sorry for taking
Thank you for a moving statement. I think part of it, in terms of tactics, Stephanie, I think part of it comes up to, really calibrating the message in such a way that will resonate with people for whom this is not on their radar otherwise. The fact that these are students, that these are poor kids who are trying to make a future for themselves and their families, that it is a systemic issue in which people have a very hard time tolerating and I think deserve our solidarity and our support. Porque tienes razón, ¿verdad? Que ya estamos hartos.
That's it, man.
Estamos hartos. It's just...
It's the same small group of people, man.
Mm-hmm. And so, really sort of making a case to connect Ayotzinapa and the situation in Mexico to the concerns that Americans might have, right? Because the thing is that there are many Americans, but at the same time, like, how do you tell? How do I tell sort of my uncle-in-law from Kansas, right? But I think part of that Thanksgiving is a good time in that sense because you go out and you have those awkward political conversations. Well, you do, right? Like, you have those absolutely awkward political conversations, but those are the times when you have a chance to actually put a face and put some kind of imaginary flesh to what would seem otherwise an abstract issue, right? To what otherwise would be an abstract problem, because I think that the general discourse in the United States tends to be their problem, right? Not our problem. Right. Siempre es lo mismo, ¿verdad? Like, it's, oh yeah, we expected. In fact, Reason magazine, this libertarian blog, had some commentary about Ayotzinapa, and it was just absolutely cynical, because it was just saying, same as it ever was. And the thing is that that's not enough. Americans have to be able to recognize that the kind of relationship that the United States and Mexico have is, for better or for worse, inextricable. Like, anybody else?
No, I want to say something. Or Yvonne, did you want to? I wanted to say one of the issues that I think has had some resonance, at least talking to colleagues on this campus, faculty colleagues, is the fact that these are students and that it is their protest that was criminalized and that resulted in their disappearance. And however ambivalent we might feel about U.S. claims to free speech and free expression as a basic right, it is nevertheless a very powerful thing that we're attached to. And thinking kind of strategically, it seems to me that that is one way to kind of translate this for a U.S. public that may or may not be receptive to a discussion of neoliberalism or a discussion of U.S. influence in Mexico or so on and so forth. So I think it is important always to bring up that wider context, but just this particular issue, I suspect, does have quite a lot of resonance, at least on campuses. So I would encourage you to open discussion on that basis.
Sí. Bueno, yo quisiera No sé.
¿Tu nombre, por favor?
Soy César y soy de Culiacán, Sinaloa. Y tengo poco tiempo por acá. Tengo poco tiempo por acá y voy a seguir hablando en español algunas ideas puntuales. La primera, hay una frase de un artista mexicano muy famoso que dice: la vida no vale nada. Y si la vida no vale nada, parece que aquí la vida tiene mucho valor, no solamente por los muertos, sino por lo que otras personas hacen o han venido haciendo con la vida de otros, con nuestra vida y con la vida de ellos mismos. Digo esto para conectarlo con una idea de que aunque haya una diferencia institucional muy marcada entre una posición estudiantil con unas condiciones sociales propias, un grupo armado militar, una fuerza judicial, y hasta ahí la dejo, aunque hay las distancias, hay algo común, y es una clase social. Y yo pienso, lo apunté así, no tengo más referentes, pero parecía como si existiera una autodestrucción de clase, porque el militar que ejecuta la acción y el policía que acata la orden, ¿qué tanto comparte con el estudiante al que mató? O al estudiante al que tiene retenida la vida. ¿Y qué lo motiva o qué valor le da a la vida de un otro que a lo mejor es igual que él? Y ahorita hemos escuchado, tenemos políticas económicas, educativas y de cualquier cosa que le queramos poner, que son políticas de exclusión y de que hacen más marginal la condición de estos sectores sociales. Esa es una primera idea que quería compartir, como esta autodestrucción de clase. Y el ejemplo más cínico lo tenemos ayer. Sale la primera dama del Estado a declarar que con el esfuerzo y el sudor de su frente se compró una casa de $7 millones. O sea, ¿de qué clase obrera estás hablando? Eso no lo puedes decir. Bueno, lo dijo, pero es un cinismo. Pero es el ícono de la diferencia más marcada que hay de clase en México. La otra idea es, decimos, fue el Estado. Y como aquí se ha dicho, yo agregaría, ha sido siempre el Estado, recientemente fue el Estado, actualmente es un Estado que nos sigue haciendo guiños de amenaza y que Peña Nieto no se cansa de criminalizar. Este acto, pensado políticamente, es un acto de desestabilización social y es un acto que pretende romper, en palabras de él, el proyecto de la nación. Entonces nosotros somos opositores, probablemente, no sé si alguno, pero yo no. Está manipulado por una fuerza extraña, pueden ponerle colores como rojos, izquierda, crimen, etcétera, no sé. Pero así se piensa en los términos de estos pequeños actos. Lo que me parece muy grave es que en esta cadena de que siempre ha sido el Estado, es y seguirá siendo, ¿de qué Estado estamos hablando? Porque si hablamos de un narcoestado y siguiéramos la lógica de que en algún momento el narcotráfico, la violencia, se infiltró en el Estado, pues pareciera que en algún momento el Estado fue puro. En algún momento lo fue. O en algún momento el Estado ha velado realmente por los intereses de la sociedad. No lo sé. Y aquí yo me pregunto, ¿cómo exigir o buscar una justicia en un Estado donde no impera la ilegalidad, donde la ejecución de la ley se va por las riendas menos humanas, por la lógica en este caso del narcotráfico? Y ya, porque no entiendo mis apuntes.
If I cannot be like video recorded on this, you can have like the audio. Just I don't want to be video recorded.
Okay. Live stream.
If you can just turn.
Okay.
I'll turn it to us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that.
Here.
Si necesitan una conexión, if you need a connection to this cause, I think that's why I'm speaking up right now. I have a lot of family in Iguala. My dad was actually visiting family in Iguala when this all started blowing up. They were gonna go pay a fee. My dad was gonna accompany my grandparents to go pay a fee to the city hall when this was all happening, and just the media was exploding, and there were just people everywhere. I think the reason for why I can speak up and I can be as politicized as I am is because I'm here and not there. Because if I were to say all these things now, I would really fear for my life, and I think that my grandparents and my parents would be really upset if I were to do these things because of what's happening, right? So I definitely recognize the privilege, and I try to step down as much as I can, especially in this topic, even though I grew up every summer going to Iguala. Like, I know exactly what it smells like when you get out of the airport, like the bus station. I know exactly, like, you know, what taxi to get, the combis, like how it smells, what it looks like, how hot it is, like the zancudos, like I feel it, right? Like, I feel it in here, and it hurts. And I have to choose to do something more than just be angry about it. My mom, when I went home a few weeks ago, and I went home for a few days, my mom just like teared up. Every time she saw the news, she just teared up because she's just like, I don't know who's gonna be next. I don't know if I'm gonna see someone that I know, like Cocula, like all of these places that she, you know, she traveled with, like traveled at and grew up around, are all being, you know, so attacked and so as if this is like a isolated thing. Right, so we don't see the fact that, like, why is it that Iguala and that Guerrero, like, my grandparents raised cattle and they had fields and they had land and it was sustainable in that time, and why is it that I'm here now, right? Why is it that my parents had to come here, struggle, so that I can be here, so that I can see at the injustices in there and be like, woof, I can't, thank goodness I'm not there, right? Like, we can't separate those two things. Like, we can't separate the things, the crimes, the things that are happening in Mexico with what we do here, right? With the policies that we have in order here in the US. Like, I feel responsible for that. And it's crazy. It's crazy to see the dependency in the most horrible ways that the U.S. creates with other countries. And to see that in a more globalized sense is overwhelming, and I think that's the reason for why, you know, we look at these 43 students and we think like, oh wow, poor them, you know? So if you need that, like, if you ever, you're like, at least you know someone that, like, and the reason for why I wanted you to turn that is because I haven't said this out loud, but my half-brother has, 2 years ago, he met his family, his dad's side of the family, and one of his uncles, who he just met, disappeared about 2 years ago. And he was traveling all over Iguala, and he was doing, what is it? What's it major? Anthropology. He was doing anthropology. And he was trying to take out the ruins and the things to preserve our cultures, and he's missing. And I think of, I mean, it's been 2 years, so I'm thinking like all those mass graves, like we need to find out who those people are, because, I mean, at least now we can know that he's there and that he's not being tortured or missing or stuff like that. But I feel like we all have to have that responsibility in ourselves, and living in this country and what this country does, and the responsibility that comes to us. It's not just an isolated thing. It's not just Mexico. That's screwed up.
Hi, so I just wanted to, so one of you mentioned earlier a quote by Angela Davis, and I wrote it down, because I think it speaks to what we're trying to get to. One does not have to be an expert to fight for justice. And I think she's referring to the expertise that most of us are here for, which is an academic or a particular scholarly field. But I think an underlying expertise is that lived experience that many of us have, especially in Latin America and Mexico. You mentioned similarities in Peru. We can talk about Brazil recently with the World Cup. I mean, the fear of repression, state repression, it's a lived experience, an expertise many of us have. Our parents have them. A lot of immigrants in this country have them. There's a reason they're here. And there's two main reasons they're here. One is economic opportunities or lack of economic opportunities in their home countries. And two, the fear of repression. And I think that's one of the things that we can talk about and have people come together, not just for Ayotzinapa, but the injustice that it's lived in many places, in many communities, everywhere. Another of the pictures I think you show was the Ayotzinapa, Mi Barrio, Tu Barrio, Ferguson, Palestina. So I think that's a way that we can all talk to people, not only within the university, but outside the university. This time around, I'm the only one in my family getting an education, and I'm seeing my siblings and other family members going on Facebook protesting, and I'm trying to figure out what's different this time, because they've never been involved, and they've always said to me, you know, go to school, put your head down, don't get involved, and this time around they're getting involved. And I think one of the differences this time is that these young students are the image of global poverty, in a sense that they're trying to fight for basic needs like educational rights for the most disenfranchised in a particular place. And this place is Mexico, los campesinos. And I think that speaks volumes of what's going to happen tomorrow in terms of what you brought up. The issues that led to this, it's the removal or the policies that led to removing key issues that were fought in the revolution. So this right to education for campesinos in Mexico, that or the ownership of petroleum for the people, and that had been removed with this, through this new, in academic terms, neoliberal policies, right? But for people, it's real. For people, the violence, the need to move, the need for opportunity. I think that's a way of not only bringing Mexican Americans, but like most immigrants in this country into the conversation, and to bring the conversation to the level of what is happening, how is the U.S. implicated. Obama just announced that he's going to make an announcement tomorrow. What is that? I mean, what is this going to change? in terms of what's happening in local communities. What is our tax money doing to these communities to perpetuate this? Sorry, my Spanish comes in London. To continue this violence that it's lived by all of us. I mean, the reason I'm here, the reason most of us are here, is because our families were running away. Even though I'm personally not from a family of campesinos, but it would be the equivalent of small business owners. So my family was afraid. I'm from Tijuana. So there's that same fear everywhere that you don't want your children living in fear, but there's not the understanding that, well, this is not safe haven. We might have free speech, sort of, if it's civil, according to this university, but we might find other forms of repression and repression because of our identities, because of where we come from, because of our history. So I invite everyone, yes, bring 3 people, but also try to connect the bigger issues with people that might not reflect themselves in Ayotzinapa, but do have a lived experience of oppression and how they're all interconnected. Thank you.
Thanks for pointing out that, and I want to emphasize, because I'm talking about strategies, I hear a lot of people saying, how do we translate things to people living in the US? And honestly, that's a very hard thing for me to think about, because I'm tired, just estoy cansada of this dynamic in which we always have to please the American, like the American, like what's in the American in the first place. But all these problems in Mexico, they've been cultivated for years, for decades, for centenarios, since the war with the US and all these colonizing dynamics that we've had since then. And I see it in Mexico and I see it here, there's so many problems from violence, from sexual human trafficking, because I happen to be from a port, and guess what? All of our problems, a lot of them come from tourism. And so I am tired that we always want to say, pity us because our country is a mess and we don't have free speech over there. No, our country is a mess and a lot of the problems come from your country, and that's why you have to listen. Stop colonizing, not only Mexico, but the rest of the world. And if a person cannot listen to that, I don't know then what translation we have to keep doing. I don't know what a conversation is going to look like if people don't even care about how they're affecting other countries. And another point is not only the Anglo person or whomever is not Mexican American, whomever is not Latino, but how do Latinos themselves are complicit in creating this narrative of development, and we love the US intervention, economic, etc. Because I know it's a class thing as well. People love development for some reason, and then they contribute to this racism and this image of the people who are indigenous as disposable. So there is a lot of our own complicitness in this dynamic, and even not being able to see other sisters and brothers from other countries who are going through what we're doing now. But when does the people who are from Mexico actually come in solidarity with Central Americans, with other communities who have been going through this violence as well? So it's not something that only Mexican Americans or Latinos are facing. So why can't we see how this is a problem in all of our communities and unify upon that?
Hey everyone, I'm gonna kind of mix my Spanish with my English. My name is Alex. I'm coming from Mexico City, Nezahualcóyotl. Es un lugar un poco grande para algunas personas, no lo conocen, algunos otros sí.
Minnesota.
I'm sorry? Okay. Well, my throat is kind of hurt right now, but I'm trying really hard. I came here with my brother. We're coming from this little town in Mexico, which is surrounded by drug dealers, killing everywhere. Everywhere you go, you have to be watching your back, taking care of your brothers, younger brothers, in case that you have them, like me. We used to be living in peace until these people came through in our block, in our neighborhood, starting all this war between the people that was around them, because it was not just the fact that they were selling drugs and they were killing other people who was coming from different places, right? It was affecting us. It was affecting the people who was living next to them. It was affecting the people who was around them in general. Kind of answering the question that you asked about how you bring people in to this revolution, because it's not just that you're going to show up and tell someone you did this wrong, you need to change. It's not just that. Here in my shirt, I have someone who everybody knows here. He was a revolutionary man. He was not just a singer. He was someone who could bring peace and could bring a message to people. I've seen a lot of white people here, people who probably don't give a shit about Mexicans, right? But they're here, and they're here for a reason. All the Mexicans and the people who's bilingual here, it's here for a reason. We can make a change, we can make a difference in our neighbors, in our street, in our block, in our families, inside our houses. It depends on how we see things and how we express ourselves. I can be the most rude or either the most educated person in this world, but that doesn't mean anything. When whatever you show to people, it's nothing. It has no value at all. The only way you can bring people in is if you show, you can bring 20 other people here, but people who just here to what? Make volume instead of, something representative and something that it's going to change.
You gotta do both, right?
Right, that's what I'm saying. You can't bring 20 other people from anywhere, but they're just going to make more people and get this room crowded. But
That's important.
But the thing is this, that you can bring people from anywhere and thousands of people, but people who, at first, they're not going to see things as we do. You want to change Mexico, you just don't want to change Ayotzinapa. We want to change the whole thing. We want change in general. This is not just happening in Ayotzinapa, it's happening in the whole city, in the whole country. We here for only one reason, unite and change our community. If you guys can bring thousands of people here, make them change, make them get a little bit of the message we're trying to share to everybody else. And for sure, that single person that you share the message is going to take it back somewhere else, and that someone is going to listen to them, and it's going to make a change in their minds. I'm not trying to say that you guys aren't doing it. A lot of us, that's why we're here. The only way we can make people change, it's bringing a message. And it's putting a little bit on their minds. And they're going to change, and they're going to see the same way we see in this world, and the same way we're seeing things that are completely wrong, and they're going to start doing something. Tomorrow is a big day for a lot of Mexicans, for all the Mexicans, for a lot of us. Let's do that tomorrow. Let's get the more people we can. Let's get millions feelings of people together to change this, not just for city, not just for nothing. You just to change the whole world. It's not just Ayotzinapa, it's in other countries around the world. And in the same way, we unite for other people that has been going through a lot of things, wars and killing everywhere. The same way we get together to bring change, to make things better for everybody, not just for one little thing. Thank you.
So we're gonna need to clear the room in a few minutes, so let's take maybe 3 more questions, one here, one there, and then one last question.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I just want to answer what Stephanie, right, had mentioned, and how can we get people involved, and as far as how do we get people to care about a serious situation such as this one. And I can only say what I personally think, which I do want to say that by organizing such as today, and such as all of the faculty has said is a very important thing, but as students, we can also take it upon ourselves to organize and try to do something, even if we think is very small, and just if it is talking to your own family, talking to a class, maybe a class that is not in Latin American studies, and just doing that makes an impact, that makes a change. Also, use social media for stuff like this. I think social media should be used for things like this. I mean, in your personal Facebook, Instagram, whatever it might be, you can utilize it for so many things besides saying, oh, I'm tired, I mean, you could use it for saying things like, today I went to this. Make it personal too. Say what you felt. Say how this impacts you, because reality is that people are not going to maybe know the situation, but they do know you. They're your friends. They're the people that you know. And so by saying that, they're the people that are going to be like, why did this really affect her? Maybe they'll get curious. I mean, you want to inject that curiosity into these people so they can really take it upon themselves to do a little bit more research. Change doesn't, as we've known, occur overnight. But I mean, if we have all these tools today, and I think it's one of the things that we should definitely use. Lastly, and I'll just try to make it quick, is I think that as people, we should definitely try to create a more human connection. I mean, just by really trying to not see it as the people in Mexico, we're all people, let's just try to make a connection besides just saying them, us, we're all people, we all matter. It doesn't matter where you're from. And I think that's really important to emphasize. So, I mean, that's it.
Juan Manuel here. Thank you for the panelists. I just have a quick question about the day after tomorrow, because so much talk among the media and being as a Mexican national who doesn't have double citizenship, and thinking about sort of brothers and sisters who are undocumented here, whose ties are to their only nationality is to Mexico. There's a call for resignation for the president too, right? There's collusion, and so should something happen where there is a call for resignation, because as much as I'm hoping for a peaceful protest, there will be disobedience and people will know tomorrow about Mexico. But that disobedience is going to spark something, and I feel the fervor, and I've been nervous all week saying, I look at my Mexican passport and I say, what the fuck is going to happen? And I just look at that passport and think, we're calling for the resignation of the president, that's only an indication of a political system that doesn't work. And if the political system doesn't work, something has to give. And when that gives, what's going to happen the day after tomorrow?
I'm bringing the mic over to what may be our last speaker because of time constraints. No, tomorrow, okay.
Sorry, this is quick and it's just a comment, but I really appreciated the discussion about the news sources and what we think of when we read them and thinking about, okay, it's a source that is appealing to an audience and what is it saying and how does that reflect on the audience. And I think specifically about talking about people who, because I'm not Mexican, I was born in Iowa, and I think talking about people who don't have that connection, but creating that connection is contextualizing. And you get that with news sources, and a lot of news sources don't contextualize, they give you the violence. And I think the big issue with that is that it creates this image where, oh my goodness, Mexicans are so violent. And it's that idea that, okay, it's like an inherent to them. They can't help but being violent. And whether or not it's not explicitly stated, I mean, sometimes it is, but you can go to those news sites and then you can look at the comments that people leave and they say, oh my goodness, can you imagine these people immigrating to our country? Like, they're so violent, they're gonna bring their gangs, they're gonna bring all of this stuff. I mean, you get that, and it's like the first comment on almost every comment section is something about, oh, don't let them in, because then our country's just gonna go down the toilet, and they're already doing it, and all the problems that we have, it's because of these immigrants. And so I think that picture of violence that, just focusing on the events, but focusing on, the more shocking ones, right? Where, oh, you have them setting fire to such and such building, or there's been this murder, this mass murder, and it's the same type of story, and you just perpetuate that narrative. So I think, like, in that, the sense of, oh, what do we do to, to get more people who don't have a connection involved? A really important thing, I guess, for me, and what I felt has just been useful for myself, is contextualizing and understanding more about what the situation is and more of the history and all of that. So just like sharing a different story, or a bigger story, broader.
Okay, this will be my last comment.
Yeah, mine's actually a question. Can one of you mention, I hope it wasn't Yvonne, but one of you all mentioned Plan Merida when you were speaking, you grasped through it, but I think it's really important that this really resonates in us today. So can y'all briefly comment the main points? And I know time constraints, we can go home and Google the rest, but yeah, please do.
So if I'm not mistaken, Plan Merida was an agreement signed by President George W. Bush and was it Vicente Fox or was it Calderon? Calderon, right? Concerning basically military or paramilitary aid from the United States to Mexico to help combat the drug war, basically on the model of Plan Colombia, which President Clinton had signed with Álvaro Uribe, right, back in the 90s. And it became sort of one of the main touch points or cornerstones of the American war on drugs vis-a-vis Mexico, but it provided for training, weaponry, supplies, personnel support, American military advising, and so on. So, and the thing is, that's just one piece of it, right? Then there's the other, Department of Defense support that that's security aid, right? So this is very telling because if we're giving money to a narco state, right, or to what's de facto a narco state, are we really doing a good job of allocating our resources? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but I mean, consider that. Yes?
Just like a quick point about
they gave, so a lot of it is funding with actual arms and stuff, and there was one, I don't remember if it was like all of this certain batch or whatever, but they were able to track it, and they found out that the arms ended up in the hands of cartel. Right, so it's super counterproductive. Like it didn't, you ended up giving guns to, you can do that too, so.
I mean, the Zetas were a creation of the U.S.
And they basically adopted. The Zetas are basically ex-Cabiles from Guatemala, so ex-special counterterrorism forces, and Mexican special forces, who now, because of demilitarization after the civil wars in Central America, had nowhere to go except, they had nowhere to go, but they had all these guns. So they were all dressed up with nowhere to go, and they were able to go ahead, and they decided to do this for profit, right? Because it was, they were able to manage the risk because they had the weaponry. And they could probably also twist the arms of the governments to collude, right? The more you begin to sort of unravel the layers of the onion, right, you realize that it's not just connected to one, sort of the war on drugs, but then also immigration and the military support, but also previous military campaigns, sort of this history of intervention and while, albeit supposedly good intention, but we all know what good intentions pave us, right? We still no one's really speaking up in Congress, in the state houses. No one's making demands on our university to speak up and at least say something about the gravity of the situation. Because our university does have contracts with the Mexican government, for whether it be for cultural exchange or even for potential economic benefit. These are important things to begin to think about, that we can sort of connect to our realities here day to day.
Okay, thank you all so much. It's just, you can Google this. Why is the U.S. government giving money to this narco, especially related to Ayotzinapa? Well, from Iguala, 60% of crack cocaine used in Chicago is the #1 state using crack cocaine, comes from Iguala. And there's your response to this. Like, if you want a clear connection of what's happening, I mean, Ayotzinapa, especially the rural communities, that's where all these, like, corrido de droga into Chicago comes from this particular location. And if these students were demanding the